Hi everyone, I'm Rose Martin, and we are right around the corner at the Virginia Museum of Transportation with an iconic backdrop. I'm here with Michael Abraham, the author of Chasing the Powhatan Arrow. Michael went on a journey, all 668.7 miles, to trace this iconic Powhatan Arrow, and along the way, you never know what's going to pop up. He shares stories from the origination of tobacco, the Hatfield and McCoy feud, a little bit about Roy Rogers, and even the future of transportation. It's time to come on and get aboard. It's time for a road trip. Let's meet him. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Rose.
Welcome to Right Around the Corner.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So I have to ask you first, why did you pick this amazing setting right here at the Virginia Museum of Transportation in front of this beauty to have your segment?
Well, this is a very special place for me. The 611 was put back into service, as you know, a few years ago for excursions. And my wife and I rode one of those excursions and got really excited about being with it and being with all the people, all the enthusiasts. What really struck me is when we were out on the route itself, the number of people who came by just to watch it go by. And we had people, you could look out the window and you could see that you could tell the enthusiasts. They had their cameras, their setups. You could tell that as soon as the locomotive itself rode by, they were scurrying away to get back in their car to chase it up to the next place. But there were also a lot of everyday people and a lot of young people, and it's a complete adrenaline experience. I don't care what you're doing.
Right.
When this comes by, you're going to stop and you're going to pay attention to this.
Well, it's an adrenaline experience right here, just being outside.
It is.
And sitting right here in front of her, so it was a great choice.
One of my trips here years and years ago, my daughter was a little girl, and when I stood close to the locomotive, she didn't even want me close to it. It was that dramatic and intimidating. But when you see her go by on the tracks, it's an unforgettable experience. And some of these children, well, probably even teenagers, had never seen a steam locomotive in their life, and it was a big deal.
Well, I had never seen a steam locomotive, so it is a real treat. Now, you talked about coming here with your daughter. As a young boy, did you ride trains with your parents?
When we could. There weren't that many around even then, but I remember a trip to New York that we took. My grandparents lived up there. My grandfather was a huge train enthusiast, and he would take trains all over the place. And then probably 30 years ago, we took an excursion run over into West Virginia. And in those days, the excursions had open carriages. So you could smell the steam, you could feel the cinders. It was quite an experience.
But how did you get here then? So your parents had a print shop and you worked in the print shop, and then you went to Virginia Tech, and mechanical engineering is your background, and now here you're traveling the country, you're chasing trains, and you're writing all about them. How did you get here?
Well, I sold the family printing business about 10 years ago, and I had an idea for a book at the time. That book turned into The Spine of the Virginias, which is this look at, I guess, this odd sibling relationship that we have between Virginia and West Virginia. We talk about the Carolinas, we talk about the Dakotas. Nobody talks about the Virginias. But I've always been intrigued, and there's not the same parity level. You know, the Dakotas to most of us seem sort of equal, the Carolinas, but there's no equivalency, I think, when people think about Virginia and West Virginia. So I wrote that book, traveled to border communities. One of my heroes in early life was Charles Kuralt on the road. And I thought, wouldn't this be a great career to go out on the road and meet people and interview people? I don't know if I'm a great writer, Rose, but I'm a good interviewer. People talk to me. And that's one of the, it's a very intimate feeling to hear people's stories and to have them share those with me. And I try to honor that intimacy by passing it on to my readers.
Why do you think they talk to you when you go by and interview them or try to get in and get the personal stories?
I think because I try and convey a level of authenticity and perhaps empathy. Everybody's got a story. We've all been through experiences in our lives. And my favorite people in the world are enthusiasts. It almost doesn't matter what they're enthusiastic about.
As long as you got a passion for something.
Yeah, it's got to be, you know, I don't care whether it's about poetry or quilting or trains, or my particular passion is motorcycles. You know, if you're passionate about something, you live a fuller life, and those are people that have the greatest stories.
So for all of these books that you've written, and congratulations on all of the awards that you've had and
Thank
for
you.
being a speaker. But I have to know, you are a couch surfer, and what does that mean? You're on your motorcycle and you're traveling around setting up interviews for your books, but you're arranging not to stay in hotels or motels.
I don't really like hotels.
Okay.
You don't meet people.
Okay.
Okay, when I travel, and we travel domestically and we travel internationally, I don't do cruises. We don't do package tours. We like to be with the people. We like to go to a specific place, not a very broad place, but just to be there and to meet the people and stay with the people. And we host people at our house as well. Couchsurfing is an internet-based hosting service where people travel around the country and around the world and stay with everyday people. And so we've been doing this for several years. And so I've done quite a bit of hosting, but we've also done some guesting, meaning that I go to someone else's house. And so on a couple of occasions with this book, I stayed with people who brought me into their home and told me their stories about their relationship to their communities and to the train economy.
Well, and you talk about the economy. That was kind of a prevailing question that you used with every single person that you happened to meet or talk to. Why was that so important?
Well, I'm a businessman and I'm interested. It's occurred to me many, many times that people make good and bad health decisions in terms of smoking, drinking, whatever it might be. When you run a business, you make good and bad health decisions. Communities make good and bad health decisions in terms of how they build their economy and keep their economy strong. And what I found on this particular corridor, as I went from Norfolk to Suffolk, to Petersburg, to Blackstone, to Crewe, to Farmville, to Lynchburg, to Roanoke, to Christiansburg, to Parisburg, to Bluefield, to Welch, Williamson, Canova, Ironton, and Cincinnati.
Phew!
Each community looked at their economy in a different way. And some of these communities were quite successful and had very vibrant economies, and some of them were among the poorest places in the country, and they weren't very far apart.
So the reason that some of these communities are thriving and others are struggling, do you attribute that to, for instance, manufacturing or coal or the rail leaving? What are some of those reasons?
Well, just generically, what I found is that there is efficiency in monocultures, but there is resiliency in diversity.
Well, let's sit with that for a second. Resiliency in diversity, meaning what?
If you're a textile town, you're a furniture town, you're a coal town, you're a railroad town, chances are good you're going to struggle as time marches on. If you're a community that does a lot of different things, for example, my hometown is Christiansburg. Christiansburg is a transportation center. It's an education center, or is at least close to Radford and Blacksburg. There's healthcare nearby, there's distribution, there's some manufacturing, there's a lot of different things that are going on to feed that economy. Through the vicissitudes of time, as one of those is not doing so well, probably there's a good chance that another one is picking up the slack. When you have a community like Welch, West Virginia, where everything is coal, when the coal industry suffers, or when there is a change in the methodology for mining coal, where you don't need as many people through the mechanization, you have nothing to fall back on. And many of these communities have not, the prevailing industry has captured the entire economy. They actively discourage other entities from coming in. And so the economies that I found that were doing the best were the ones that were doing the most different things.
Well, when you mentioned coal, I found it interesting that you talked a little bit about how, you know, the veins were either stripped or the tops of the mountains were cut, or the skill set needed now is so different than it was before that it's not a simple fix to just open up the coal mines and put people back to work in some of these communities that you know that are disparaged and are having a really hard time right now.
They're having a very hard time. When coal was initially developed as an industry in the late 1800s, and this is the reason for the N&W, the Norfolk and Western, throughout most of its lifespan, was a coal hauling railroad. And so when the railroad got to the community in the coal fields of West Virginia or southwestern Virginia or Kentucky, as soon as the railway, it was a codependent relationship. You couldn't mine the coal without a railroad, because you had no way to transport it, okay? You couldn't run a railroad without the coal because it fired the locomotives. But once the railroad arrived in town, these economies would blossom, would bloom, and they would look for people all over the country, blacks from the deep south, poor immigrants from New York coming in from Europe, and bring these people into the coal fields and put them to work. One of the astounding things that I found was that the McDowell County, West Virginia, which is Welch is the county seat, in 1950, in the 1950 census, there were 99,000 people in McDowell County, West Virginia. My county, Montgomery County, doesn't have that many today. It's about 95 or 96,000. And all of these people were jammed into these little hollows, and all of the working men were coal miners or doing something in support of the coal mining. When the coal industry didn't need that many workers anymore, the economy collapsed, and they've been on a 65-year decline.
Again, because of no diversity, so they have nothing else to fall back on.
Nothing else for those people to do. And so there was this massive diaspora of people leaving the coal fields. And even to this day, many of these communities have not really been able to diversify and bring people back in and rebuild their communities. And so, you know, they used to say that their two biggest exports were coal and young people.
Oh, yeah, sure. Coal and young people. Well, and in that time period too, the coal companies had so much influence in the town, whether it was through the housing or the stores or the schools. So when they pulled the plug on that, essentially, right, everything just went away.
They were the municipalities. Yeah. They provided the schools. They provided the law enforcement. They did everything.
But the pride of the people is what also struck me in your book when you went on your journey, and they said, you know, churches don't come to prosperous areas, so we know how people are perceiving us when church groups show up here. Yeah.
Right.
It was heartening to read that and think, people think they're doing the right thing and they're trying to get in and provide help and support, but sometimes you have to be careful.
Yes,
you know, you have to be careful. When you write, do you have a certain process that you use? Do you write every day? What's that like for you?
Well, the beauty of travelogues, and this is my third travelogue. So I did the one about Virginia and West Virginia. I did a travelogue of the Crooked Road, our heritage music trail. And then I did this travelogue from Norfolk to Cincinnati. The beauty of them is that the structure is already in place by the time I sit down and begin, because I know I'm going from place to place.
Have you already set up the interviews ahead of time?
No.
Along the way?
Occasionally I'll do 2 or 3 in a specific location. For example, when I went to Norfolk, I had an interview with David Good, who is a Roanoke Valley native and was at one point the CEO of Norfolk Southern. And when you talk to people in that stature, you want to prearrange your interviews. But I talk to everybody, and everybody talks to me. So I talk to CEOs, I talk to business leaders, economic development people, I talk to mayors, but I also talk to panhandlers, street people, hobos. One of the most memorable stories for me in the book was a long conversation I had with a hobo.
Rocco.
Rocco,
yes,
the young man who rode the rails, and he spent 10 years of his young life riding the rails and getting kicked off and getting thrown in jail and hopping back on the train again for someplace else.
Well, and that part was interesting to me because I was thinking, you know, when he was talking about how he had to be careful not to get bounced around, for some reason in your mind, when you see it in the movies, you know, you just hop on and you're just riding along, but it definitely wasn't like that at all.
No, boxcars are not comfortable.
Right, it wasn't like that at all.
They don't have padded chairs in boxcars.
Well, the people you met along the journey, were you able to be flexible in terms of your time? So how much time did you decide to stay from one point to another, or chase the Powhatan Arrow to its next stop?
Well, the book is written as if it's one continuous journey, more or less. You can tell because I transitioned from being in a car to being on a motorcycle. But generally, that was a bit of a fabrication. What I did instead is I went to Norfolk and I spent 3 days there. And on the way back, I went to Suffolk and Petersburg. And then I needed to return home for business obligations. I went back again to Blackstone and Crewe and Farmville and Lynchburg, and then came home again.
So how long did it take, start to finish?
A year.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, took about a year. Well, that includes the writing too. And the writing was interspersed with the actual research and travel.
Yeah. Well, and you call it a travel log in economic geography, but it's so much more, because, you know, you don't give us a table of contents. you started out very differently, right? By having this map of where we're going to be going and taking us immediately on that journey. But I can tell that you also have a love of history, because as we were traveling through Appomattox, for instance, you know, what a beautiful story, and you took us back to that time period. Why is that so important to weave so much history into traveling and economic geography?
Because Virginia history, West Virginia history, Ohio history, which are the three states that are involved, their history is economic history. Okay, the Civil War had a dramatic impact on the economy of Virginia. Okay, specifically we're talking about, you mentioned Appomattox. The business in Appomattox is history. It is, you know, a world-known place for where the Civil War ended, and so that's part of their economy. So in each place I have in mind, well, how does what happened here in 1864, 1865, how does that impact where we are today? And the interesting thing to me about history is that it's ongoing. We are still living history. We are still part of what went on way back when. The decisions that were made way back when by military leaders, by business leaders, are still impacting the way we make a living in some of these communities. Roanoke, for example, was built by and for the railroad.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know this when you're here today, but my hometown of Christiansburg is 100 years older than Roanoke. Salem is, I think, 100 years older than Roanoke. Roanoke is a very new city. And the N&W came along and they said, well, if you go up that way, that takes you up into the Shenandoah Valley. You go over that way, that takes you off into eastern Virginia. You go down that way, it's North Carolina. And this was the funneling point where these rail lines came together. And Norfolk, and the founders of Norfolk and Western said, that's where we want our headquarters to be.
Well, part of what I love, you talk about being 100 years and the history that's so woven in these communities. When you wrote about Appomattox and you wrote about the meeting with the guard and how, you know, one day a year it's not open, and tell a little bit about that story, how, you know, he kind of gives it back to the soldiers.
Well, you know, when I interview someone, you never know exactly what to ask, and you sort of let the interview go where it might. And in this particular case, we were talking to the superintendent at the surrender ground in Appomattox. And I just had this notion to ask, and because I'm carrying a little voice recorder, you don't have to use everything someone might say. But I had this idea and it just blurted out, and I said, is this place haunted? And his response was, no, I'm not really into that kind of thing. I don't think of it that way. He says, but you know, invariably, every year, we're only closed 2 days a year, you know, Christmas and New Year's. And invariably, when I'm walking down from our little setup, our museum area here, down to the parking lot, I find myself turning around and looking back up and saying, okay, folks, for 36 hours, we're going to leave you alone. It's back to yours again.
Yeah, and I thought about that. I'm like, they just kind of close the door and say, okay, we're done.
And it was a goosebump moment for me. And I was there with a man who took me there, a friend of he was our tie. He's the man who introduced me to the superintendent. And you could just see his face. He just was like elated by this idea that this was not just an historic location, but it was somebody's home, and children grew up there, you know, and people, you know, the war came to Appomattox for basically like 2 days in April of 1865, and forever changed it. Okay, but it was still somebody's hometown. And so there were a number of moments in the course of this book that were completely unexpected, but were so memorable. One of the stories that I like to read to audiences when I'm called on as a speaker is the story about the firefighters over in West Virginia, and this woman who calls on a wreck scene where a 20-year-old girl has killed herself in a car accident, and all of her stuff spills out onto the street in the accident as the car flips over. And this woman firefighter goes out in the street. It starts to rain, and you know, she knows from her training that she has to leave the things where they landed. And it's starting to rain, and she thinks about this girl and her mother, And she says, this little girl is somebody's baby. And she goes out on the street and she picks this stuff up. And her supervisor said, you know, you're going to get in trouble with the medical examiner. And she said, I don't care. It's just something I have to do. The medical examiner comes, she puts it back out on the street so the photographs can be taken. The medical examiner says, it's okay, it'll be fine. And I drive away from there. I remember distinctly, I hopped on my motorcycle to continue the journey, and I'm thinking, how in the world am I going to get this one past my editors?
Right. Well, but those tender moments are in here, and I mean, and that's what makes this beautiful, because you have those tender moments, but you also have some humorous stories that you find yourself laughing. One, your GPS story about talking, right, as you're trying to find your way. We've all been there, where the GPS is telling you to turn around carefully, right? Make a U-turn when you can, make a U-turn when you can. I have to say, one other thing that just struck me was the Hatfield and the McCoys, and meeting up with them. We all, the iconic feud, but I have to say, this was so funny to me when you happen to, meet her, and she's like, okay, I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't do drugs or eat sugar, I grow tomatoes. And then she says on page 380, I hate violence, but if you make me mad, I'm just like him, devil ants, and I'm dangerous. I'm a Christian woman, but if you come at me with a gun, you're gonna die. Would you defend yourself? And I think to myself, the Hatfield and the McCoys, that's kind of what I would have expected. But that had to just be fascinating.
Well, I met Nancy Hatfield. Nancy was a great-granddaughter of Devil Anse Hatfield himself, the patriarch of the Hatfield clan during the Hatfield and McCoy feud. And the question that came to my mind is, what is it like being in this well-known American family? And my expectation was she was just going to well up with pride and say, I'm a Hatfield and I'm so pleased that, everybody in the world has heard about our family. And instead she looks at me and she says, drama, all the time. She says, it's not over. We're the most militaristic family in America. And I'm like, oh my goodness.
Not the answer you were expecting.
What am I going to ask now?
Right, not the answer
And
you
she just rolled on with her story about, this juxtaposition of being very hospitable people, of bringing guests in with the Hatfield McCoy Trail. There are a lot of four-wheelers and off-road motorcycle riders that come up there. But at the same time, don't cross us.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay.
I love that quote in the book.
Yeah.
I think that was great. And there's so many other things in the book. Would you be willing to read a passage for us?
Yeah, absolutely. The passage that I have in mind is from right here.
Okay.
On the 611, literally in the cab. I had a conversation with a woman named Sherry George, and she was one of the main volunteers who helped to get this thing going and back on the excursion service. So I'm going to read about the resuscitation of the 611 and getting it back into excursions. Sherry invited me into the cab of the 611, up its steep ladder rungs, where she sat in the fireman's seat and me in the engineer's seat. I told her about my book project and asked her about her interest. I fell in love with steam locomotives as a kid, she said. The 611 is an iconic symbol with grace, beauty, power, and speed. The 611 was a purpose-built locomotive for the topography and schedule on which it needed to run. It's beautiful to see static sitting in a museum, but nothing like seeing it in motion. It left a tattoo in my heart. The 611 was steam on a different scale, comparing a prop airplane to a jetliner. It was modern steam. Large steam, beautiful steam. For 3 decades, I've been intimately familiar with this machine. When the chairman of Norfolk Southern agreed to allow the museum to run the 611 on its rails, it was full throttle after that. We knew the tremendous interest and support we'd get. We adopted the name Fire Up 611, and the checks started flowing in. We received anywhere from $6.11 from kids to checks in the thousands. We received some checks for over $100,000. We got lots of media and fan attention. When disassembly and refurbishing got underway, volunteers came from all over the country. I tracked over 10,000 volunteer hours. I spent over 3,000 hours myself. She went on with the incredible orchestration of getting the enormous project completed in under a year. And then the long mothballed Norfolk and Western J-Class 611 steamed triumphantly back to Roanoke, amidst a corridor of thousands of admiring, elated fans. She said, I always thought I was the 611's biggest fan, But I came to realize that there are thousands of people who love this machine so much. Old men, kids who weren't even born the last time it ran. I met an old man who worked at the East End shops during the original construction. He has tremendous pride in it. The story you're looking for isn't about me. It's not about a single person. This locomotive we're sitting on was designed and built by men from Roanoke before I was born. This is their story, their achievement. It might be the best thing this region has ever done. It was the most powerful 484 constructed in the United States. There is a lot here for the people who are associated with it and for their families to be proud of. I'm well known for my work, but it's not about me. It's about the continuum. I ride excursions all over the country, she continued. When we steamed back into Roanoke in May of 2015, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. We had people come from Europe. We had people come from the United Kingdom, from Australia and Japan. I was blown away by the crowds. I couldn't believe it.
Thank you so much for sharing this journey and your passion for railroads. It's been really special to be right here in front of the 611 at the Virginia Museum of Transportation. So a special thanks to Michael Abraham and his book, Chasing the Powhatan Arrow. If you'd like to know more about Michael, his work, his other books, other stories from Chasing the Powhatan Arrow, make sure to check out more of our conversation online. And special thanks to you for joining us. I'm Rose Martin, and I will see you next time right around the corner.
Production funding for Right Around the Corner provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Anne Ray Foundation, and by viewers like you. Thank you.